The polished hallways of Kensington Palace hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-run institution, but behind the gilded doors, an invisible tension had taken root. For months, those who worked in the private quarters had noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere whenever the Queen and the Princess of Wales occupied the same space. It was nothing as crude as a slammed door or a raised voice. Such displays were beneath the dignity of the firm. But it was there, and a cold undercurrent that made seasoned courtiers choose their words carefully. The Princess of Wales, Catherine, felt it most acutely during the weekly family coordination meetings. These gatherings, intended to align schedules and charitable focuses, had become exercises in navigating a minefield. Queen Camilla, seated at the polished mahogany table, with the ease of decades spent in royal circles, would often steer conversations toward projects and patronages that were distinctly her own. That her tone pleasant, but her meaning clear. There were territories, and there were boundaries. Catherine, ever patient and observant, would listen, her hands folded gracefully, offering input only when directly asked. She had learned in the years since joining the family that there was a time to push and a time to wait. This, she sensed, was a time to wait. The staff noticed the small things. A seating arrangement at a private family dinner that placed the two women at opposite ends of the table. A conversation that would falter when one entered the room. A palace aide, who had served the late Queen Elizabeth II for decades, watched the dynamic with a heavy heart. The Queen had a way of making everyone feel included, the aide later confided to a colleague. Now, it feels like we are choosing sides even when we are not meant to. The friction was not born of loud arguments, but of 1,000 small cuts. A look held a moment too long, a piece of advice given that was clearly not intended as helpful, an invitation extended just a little too late. For Catherine, the strain was an added weight on shoulders already bearing the load of a young family and a grueling public schedule. She would retreat to apartment 1A at the end of the day, finding solace in the chaotic normalcy of her children, Prince George's endless questions about history, Princess Charlotte's determined independence, and Prince Louis's irrepressible energy. Prince William, her staunch ally, watched his wife navigate this political labyrinth with a mixture of pride and protective fury. He had seen what the pressures of the institution had done to his mother, and he was determined that history would not repeat itself. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he would remind Catherine in their quiet moments, his voice low and intense. "I know," she would reply, squeezing his hand, "but I have to be ready, for them, for the future." She was thinking of her children, of the crown that would one day rest on William's head, and of her own role in the story that was still being written. The simmering tensions of the palace corridors were suddenly and brutally unexposed to the world during a state visit that was supposed to showcase the strength of the special relationship. The visit of Donald and Melania Trump to the United Kingdom was a meticulously planned piece of diplomatic theater, every handshake and smile choreographed for the global media. But live television has a way of unraveling the best-laid plans. It happened in a split second, a moment so fleeting that many in the room missed it, and but one that the cameras captured with unsparing clarity. The scene was a reception with dignitaries. Queen Camilla was engaged in conversation with Melania Trump, the two women leaning in with practiced smiles. Catherine stood nearby, poised and waiting, a silent sentinel in her role as a senior royal. As the conversation seemed to reach a natural pause, Catherine took a small, polite step forward, perhaps to be introduced or to gently join the discussion. In that instant, Miss Camilla's hand moved. It was a subtle gesture, a slight turn of the body, and a hand that appeared to guide or, as the footage would later suggest, gently push Catherine to the side as Camilla re-engaged more closely with the visiting First Lady. The interaction lasted less than 2 seconds, but its impact reverberated around the world. Social media erupted. The clip was played, replayed, and analyzed in slow motion. Commentators and royal watchers were divided. Some saw it as a clear snub, a deliberate act of dismissal from a queen asserting her seniority over the future queen. Others argued it was a nothing burger, a clumsy but innocent gesture in a crowded room, perhaps even Camilla trying to alert Catherine to a change in the protocol regarding the arrival of the royal carriages. It was a moment of pure protocol, one defender insisted. Camilla was simply managing the space. But the damage was done. The narrative of a rift, long whispered about in private, it now had its public proof. The hashtag Pushgate began to trend, and the delicate veil of royal unity had been torn. Within the palaces, the reaction was one of controlled panic. The king's private secretaries held urgent meetings to assess the fallout. For Prince William, the footage was a confirmation of his worst fears. He was said to be especially upset, not just by the gesture itself, but by the public humiliation it represented for his wife. Catherine, for her part, maintained her composure. At the next public engagement, she smiled as brightly as ever, her demeanor flawless. But those close to her noted a new, almost imperceptible coolness in her bearing. The gloves, as one insider put it, were off. The incident had crystallized the unspoken into the undeniable, and it placed King Charles III in an impossible position, caught between his wife and the woman who represented the future of his dynasty. In the days following the Trump visit, the atmosphere at Buckingham Palace was thick with unspoken truths. King Charles III, a man who had spent his entire life waiting to be the arbiter of the institution, now found himself presiding over a family fractured along visible fault lines. He watched the news cycles with a growing sense of dread, recognizing the familiar pattern of a royal scandal eroding public trust. The image of his wife and his daughter-in-law, the two most prominent women in the monarchy, locked in a silent conflict. It was a gift to the tabloids and a poison to the crown's carefully cultivated image of stability. Charles understood the stakes better than anyone. He had lived through the annus horribilis of his mother's reign, witnessed the fallout from his own broken marriage, and managed the slow, painful rehabilitation of Camilla's public image. He would not allow his reign to be defined by a squabble over protocol. In private meetings with his most trusted advisors, the conversation turned to solutions. And some counseled patience, suggesting the storm would pass. Others whispered that a line had been crossed and that the Queen's behavior, intentional or not, had to be addressed. It was then that Charles made a decision that surprised even his closest aides. He would not just soothe the situation, he would reset the balance of power. The instrument of this reset was as symbolic as it was substantive: access to the royal jewelry collection. For centuries, and the gems and tiaras of the House of Windsor had been more than mere adornment. They were a visual language of status, favor, and belonging. The late Queen Elizabeth had been the ultimate gatekeeper, loaning pieces with a subtlety that conveyed approval. Since her passing, that gatekeeping had informally fallen to Queen Camilla, and it was an open secret in palace circles that she had been less than forthcoming with Catherine. If specific requests for certain heirlooms for key tours or state banquets had been met with delays or quiet refusals. It was a soft power play, a way of signaling who held the seniority in the female hierarchy of the family. When King Charles summoned Catherine to a private audience, the purpose was initially unclear. She arrived at his study to find him standing by the window, his expression thoughtful. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He spoke of the future, of the long game of monarchy, and of the need for the institution to project an image of unbreakable unity. Then he moved to his desk and handed her a small, leather-bound ledger. It was the key to the jewelry vaults. Charles had overruled his wife. He granted the Princess of Wales unrestricted access to the royal collection, a privilege usually reserved for the sovereign and the queen consort. It was a stunning, decisive move. "These belong to the crown," he told her, according to a source close to the household. "And the crown's future is you and William. You should have what you need to represent it." The news of the king's decision sent a shockwave through the palace. It was a public vote of confidence in Catherine, a direct empowerment of the heir's wife, and an undeniable rebuke to Camilla's attempts to control the narrative. For Catherine, it was more than a box of jewels. It was a crown of validation. For William, it was proof that his father could still put the institution above personal dynamics. And for Camilla, it was a stark reminder that in the hierarchy of the monarchy, the bloodline of the future king would always outweigh the influence of the queen consort. In the quiet of her sitting room at Clarence's house, Camilla absorbed the news with the practiced stoicism of a woman who had weathered decades of public scrutiny. The king's decision, delivered to her not as a request, but as a fait accompli, stung with a particular sharpness. It was a rare check on her influence, a reminder that her role, while elevated, existed in service to the future. For a moment, the composure she wore like armor threatened to crack. But she was a survivor. She had navigated the hostility of a nation that once vilified her. She would navigate this. The question was not whether she would accept the king's will, she had no choice, but how the family would move forward from this moment of public fracture and private correction. The opportunity for a reckoning came not in a formal setting, but in the unexpected quiet of a late afternoon at Windsor Castle. The family had gathered for a private weekend, a tentative attempt at normalcy following the tumultuous weeks. King Charles, weary from his cancer treatments and the weight of the crown, had retreated to his study. William and Catherine were in their apartments, the children occupied with movies and games. It was then that Charles, seeking a moment of connection, sent for Catherine. He wanted to walk the grounds with her, to talk away from the listening ears of courtiers. As they walked along the gravel paths, the conversation turned reflective. Charles spoke of his mother, of the lessons she had imparted about patience and the long view. And he talked of his own early days in the family, the loneliness he had felt, and his determination that William's transition would be smoother. Catherine listened, offering the quiet empathy that was her hallmark. She understood this was his way of bridging the gap, of acknowledging the strain without explicitly naming it. They talked of George, Charlotte, and Louis, and Charles's face softened at the mention of his grandchildren. For a moment, they were just a father-in-law and daughter-in-law, bound by a shared love for the man who connected them. It was in this moment of rare, unguarded connection that the scene unfolded. As they paused by the long walk, with the castle silhouetted against the fading light, Charles reached out and took Catherine's hand in both of his. It was a paternal gesture, warm and reassuring. He looked at her, his eyes holding a mixture of gratitude and resolve. He didn't need to say the words, but they were understood. "I see you. I value you. You are the future." It was a silent anointing, a transfer of trust that transcended the protocols of the palace. Catherine squeezed his hand back, a simple gesture of acceptance. The tension of the past months seemed to dissipate in that shared moment, replaced by a quiet understanding. But the silence was not destined to last. From the direction of the castle, a figure approached. Queen Camilla, having seen them from the window, had made her way down to the grounds. Her walk was brisk, and her posture rigid. As she drew close, the warmth of the moment evaporated, replaced by a chill that cut through the evening air. She looked at the tableau before her, her husband holding the hand of the Princess of Wales, and her expression was unreadable. Then she spoke. Her words were not loud, but they carried the weight of absolute authority, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Charles, the Canadian Prime Minister is on the secured line. He requires the sovereign. Now." The firmness in her voice was unmistakable. It was a